Happy Sunday, everyone. Today we're tackling a topic that I've been asked from time to time. We're going to dig in a little deep into the question of whether Joseph Smith used a seer stone looking in a hat to translate the Book of Mormon. Let's start with some, we'll call them competing claims, differences of opinion on this precise question. Let's begin here with a video clip of President Nelson talking about it.
Quite miraculous, really, through the gift and power of God. We have a lot of suggestions about how it was done. We know that they had a table like this. We know they had the golden plates covered usually, and Joseph used these the Urim and Thummim seer stones in the hat. It was easier for him to see the light when he take that position.
The church's official position, as you no doubt may surmise from that video, is that among other things, Joseph did use this kind of chocolate-covered dark stone that he had, a seer stone, looking in a hat to translate the Book of Mormon. Here's a video that the church history department put out about that.
So what about the seer stone, for instance? What was its involvement in the translation process?
So Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's wife, and Martin Harris, his friend, and David Whitmer, his friend, who were around during the time of the translation of the Book of Mormon, said that he used a seer stone to translate parts of the Book of Mormon, as well as the Urim and Thummim. And Martin Harris explained that Joseph Smith started using the seer stone instead of the Urim and Thummim for convenience.
Wait, so what might that mean for convenience?
Well, that's a really good question. We're not really sure what that means. But if you think of the Urim and Thummim, the descriptions that are given of the Urim and Thummim, it's described as two clear stones in a rim like glasses. And the Book of Mormon says that these stones are what constitutes seers. Having and using these stones are what constitutes seers. So the Urim and Thummim actually is this special pair of seer stones. And we have these descriptions of the Urim and Thummim connected to the breastplate, and that they're large and that they don't fit on Joseph Smith's face. And we even have accounts that he takes the lenses out of the rim and puts them in a hat, which is the way he used the seer stone. So if he uses his own seer stone rather than the Urim and Thummim, he can put the Urim and Thummim and the breastplate away somewhere safe and just use his seer stone. And that's more convenient.
Now, that clip references quotes from Emma Smith and Martin Harris, David Whitmer. We'll get into those in just a moment. Let's go to the other side. Here, for example, among those arguing that Joseph did not look into a hat using a seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon, this is a gal named Hannah Stoddard, who works for the Joseph Smith Foundation. Here's what she says about it.
So when we come to the translation of the Book of Mormon, it is contrary to the nature of God. It is contrary to our doctrine. It is contrary to how revelation works, that Joseph Smith would have sat in a chair, hunched over, stuffing his face in a hat where he couldn't even breathe for days and days and days, reading off of a black rock he got from a past in treasure digging.
Bold words, right? Especially when the church's official position is about exactly what you're saying didn't happen. You're saying that it's contrary to how revelation works, basically trying to say God isn't going to do that, period, ever. Bold claim. Of course, there are other people. Here's one of many social media posts I found out about it, saying that scholars and historians are basing the stone in a hat theory on secondhand witnesses who couldn't possibly understand what they were seeing. They didn't know what a Urim and Thummim was, but they had seen seer stones a lot in their day. Joseph Smith, a first-hand witness, never mentioned a stone in a hat. This person then said, scriptures mentioning a stone in a hat, 0. Scriptures describing a breastplate and 2 stones acting as spectacles, many. You go ahead and believe the historians. I'll believe Joseph Smith himself and the scriptures. So clearly there's some differences of opinion as to whether Joseph Smith actually indeed used a seer stone in a hat Of course, many people, starting with South Park and then later the church itself being more open with this claim, saying, here's the seer stone itself that's been kind of handed down through the generations. It was in the First Presidency vault. They shared some pictures of it. And then a lot of people are like, well, I've been lied to because, all the art and that was depicting it didn't show that. And, claims of deception. And even when you can go back and look in like church manuals and ensign articles for decades and decades, and there were people talking about this. So it's not like it was entirely hidden. But what are we talking about? We're talking really about the Urim and Thummim more broadly than this seer stone specifically, which we'll get into. What is the Urim and Thummim? Well, it's a Hebrew term that means lights and perfections. And it's kind of interesting because there are scattered references throughout the Bible to the Urim and Thummim, but biblical scholars are kind of confused because the Bible doesn't describe how the Urim and Thummim was used, or even really a description of the object itself. It just says the Urim and Thummim. Here, for example, is a quote from gotquestions.org, which is an evangelical Christian website, kind of an FAQ site where they try and explain a lot of stuff from their perspective. They say, no one knows the precise nature of the Urim and Thummim or exactly how they were used. The Bible simply does not give us enough information. References to the Urim and Thummim are rare in the Bible, which I find fascinating, right? It's like, oh, here's this thing that's kind of mentioned from time to time. We have no clue what it is. And of course, lacking any access to modern revelation and additional scripture, they're kind of stuck with this Bible that says this a few times, and therefore, let's just cast it aside and not pay attention to it because we don't know. Well, fortunately, in the restored gospel, we do have much more insight and information into the Urim and Thummim. There's a question that's interesting as to whether there is only one Urim and Thummim or whether there are more than one Urim and Thummim. For example, in Abraham 3, which Joseph revealed. In verse 1, it says, and I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in Ur of the Chaldees. So Abraham has the Urim and Thummim. And later we read in section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants that one is given to the brother of Jared upon the mount when he talked to the Lord face to face. So here immediately we say, okay, Abraham has one, and then one is given to the brother of Jared. Let's read a little bit more about that one first. In the 3rd chapter of Ether. And behold, when ye shall come unto me, shall write them, and shall seal them up, that no one can interpret them. These are the records of the brother of Jared's vision. For ye shall write them in a language that they cannot be read. And behold, these 2 stones will I give unto thee, and ye shall seal them up also with the things which ye shall write. For behold, the language which ye shall write, I have confounded. Wherefore I will cause in mine own due time that these stones shall magnify to the eyes of men these things which ye shall write. Later in verse 28, it says that the Lord commanded him to seal up the 2 stones that he had received, and that they wouldn't be shown until the Lord would show them to the children of men later on. So, could Abraham's Urim and Thummim be the same as the brother of Jared's Urim and Thummim? Perhaps, right? The Lord could give this tool and then receive it back unto himself, only to then give it to the next person. So, it's possible that there's just one that we're talking about. It's also possible that the Lord has created multiple Urim and Thummim, which, of course, Urim and Thummim, the I am at the end of the word signifies plural. So perhaps it's not far-fetched to think that there are plural Urim and Thummim themselves. The Levite Urim and Thummim turns up next. This is one of the rare biblical mentions to it that the gotquestions.org people acknowledged. In Exodus chapter 28, here Moses gives a Urim and Thummim to Aaron, silent on where it comes from. Moses, interestingly, is given specific instruction on how to fashion the high priest's breastplate, but there's no instruction given about how to design the Urim and Thummim, which suggests, to me at least, that they already existed. It's not like this new thing that he was fully constructing. It's like, hey, we're going to build your breastplate based on these characteristics that God told me. And then also, hey, this Urim and Thummim here that I'm giving you, here's how we're going to implement this, pre-existing item. So Exodus 28, and thou shalt put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and Thummim, and they shall be upon Aaron's heart, when he goeth in before the Lord. And Aaron shall bear the judgment of the Lord of the children of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually. So Moses and then Aaron may have had Abraham's Urim and Thummim handed down through the ages, or again, could have been just directly given to Moses like it was to Abraham, like it was to the brother of Jared. We don't really know. What we do know is that Mosiah the first also had a Urim and Thummim. This comes from Omni, verse 20. And it came to pass in the days of Mosiah, there was a large stone brought unto him with engravings on it, and he did interpret the engravings by the gift and power of God. Note that this is Mosiah the first, the elder. He is the father of Benjamin, King Benjamin, who then was the father of Mosiah the second, who, as we'll get into in just a second, is also a seer and utilizes this gift and power of God to translate an additional record. But here he's translating a large stone with engravings that was discovered, and he interprets it using the interpreters. So Mosiah the elder has the Urim and Thummim. Then we go to Mosiah 8. This is where Limhi is relating how they found this additional record, right? He's like, we were anxious to find the land of our forefathers, and so I sent out this expedition, and they found this land of many bones, but didn't find our people. But they found these plates, they brought them back, we can't translate them. Hey, Ammon, do you know anyone who can? So Mosiah 8. Now Ammon said unto him, I can assuredly tell thee, O king, of a man that can translate the records, for he has wherewith that he can look, and translate all records that are of ancient date, and it is a gift from God. And the things are called interpreters, and no man can look in them except he be commanded, lest he should look for that which he ought not, and he should perish. And whosoever is commanded to look in them, the same is called a seer. So again, his grandfather Mosiah had the large stone. He had the interpreters. He translated that record. Here, Mosiah, the grandson, has the interpreters. Therefore, he is a seer. He is commanded to look in them, or allowed to look in them and translate things. We go a few decades later, chapter 28 of Mosiah, where he translates this Jaredite record. It took some time for the expedition to finally arrive and reunite with them and to get these records moved over. Chapter 28, and now he translated them by the means of those two stones which were fastened into the two rims of a bow. Now these things, which were prepared from the beginning and were handed down from generation to generation for the purpose of interpreting languages, and they have been kept and preserved by the hand of the Lord, that he should discover to every creature who should possess the land the iniquities and abominations of his people, and whosoever has these things is called seer, after the manner of old times. So here's some commentary from Mormon, talking about that there are two stones. He says that they were prepared from the beginning and handed down from generation to generation. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's wrap up first with chapter 37 of Alma. This is Alma speaking to his son Helaman. He's referring to the 24 plates and the interpreters that have been passed down, Mosiah to Alma, now to Helaman, from generation to generation, right? It says, and now I will speak unto you concerning those 24 plates, that ye keep them, that the mysteries and the works of darkness and their secret works, or the secret works of those people who've been destroyed, may be made manifest unto this people. Yea, all their murders and robbings and their plunderings and all their wickedness and abominations may be made manifest unto this people. Yea, and that ye preserve these interpreters. For behold, the Lord saw that his people began to work in darkness, yea, work secret murders and abominations. Therefore the Lord said, if they did not repent, they should be destroyed from off the face of the earth. And the Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant Gezellim a stone, which shall shine forth in darkness unto light, that I may discover unto my people who serve me, that I may discover unto them the works of their brethren, yea, their secret works, their works of darkness, and their wickedness and abominations. Okay, Gezellim, huh? That term, that name is ambiguous, right? The Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant Gezellim a stone, which shall shine forth in darkness unto light. So that's ambiguous where it is, because grammatically it could refer either to the servant, right? It could mean, the Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant named Gezellim a stone. So it could mean the servant's name or nickname label is Gezellim, but it could also refer to the stone. I will prepare unto my servant Gezellim, whoever that is, that symbolic servant. I will prepare unto my servant, whoever that is, a stone named Gezellim, right? So it can kind of go either way. I mean, Wilford Woodruff argued that it was the stone that was the name of this like seer stone. The Scripture Index says that Gezellim is a name given to a servant of God. So there's some competing interpretations here and have been in the past about what the Gezellim is. But if this is the same Urim and Thummim that was used by the brother of Jared, the interpreters with the plates, then Mosiah the first, the elder, may have found it at the same time that he discovered Coriantumr's stone. Because remember that Limhi didn't find interpreters, they found the plates. And then Ammon says, oh yeah, Mosiah has this, and then he got it from his grandfather. So it's possible that even though the interpreters were sealed up with the plates, the Jaredite record, that they instead got tied over with the stone instead, and that had the some of the Jaredite record, and so maybe Mosiah the first got anyway. So that's one option, is that this is still the brother of Jared, Urim and Thummim interpreters passed down through the generations, and then Mosiah the first finds it. It's separated from the plates, but then when the plates are found, the interpreters are used. It's also possible, as with the brother of Jared and Abraham, that the Lord himself gave the interpreters to Mosiah the first, or someone preceding him. But it could have been, angels kind of moving the Urim and Thummim around to whoever they needed to have it, rather than this kind of strict lineage and passing down all the time. It could be that the Jaredite Urim and Thummim, as Mormon shares that they were prepared from the beginning and were handed down from generation to generation. So that kind of suggests that, well, this is the Jaredite one, and it did come across with the records, presumably the stone and not the plates. But Mormon using the term from generation to generation or prepared from the beginning, like something prepared from the beginning can be given and taken back by the Lord, right? And generation to generation could just mean from Mosiah the first down to Moroni. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Mosiah the first got it from anyway. So there's ambiguity, there's uncertainty here about whether we're talking about the interpreters, the Urim and Thummim, always and forever, or if there's multiple, or if there is only one, but God is kind of taking it back and giving it to people rather than, passing it down entirely and only. Okay, Joseph Smith, of course, in his own history says that there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones fastened to a breastplate constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones were what constituted seers in ancient or former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. So Joseph here is describing, like others did, the fact that there are 2 stones in a silver bow of sorts. We're talking about stones. Okay, now let's get into the question. Joseph Smith. We know from his own testimony, right? He used the Urim and Thummim that was prepared with the plates, right? The gold plates. But did he use this seer stone as well, or instead, right? What's the situation here? Let's dig into it. First, we're going to start with some contemporary statements. And by contemporary, I'm saying before 1850. So still after Joseph's death, but close enough that, we could cut it off at Joseph's death, but I'm just going to say 1850 and earlier. And then we'll get into statements that are more recent than 1850. So the first mentions of a seer stone in a hat come from antagonistic sources. For example, in 1829, the New York newspaper Rochester Advertiser and Daily Telegraph posted that the Golden Bible was found together with a huge pair of spectacles. By placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, interpret these characters. So here we're saying spectacles in a hat. That sounds like the Urim and Thummim that Joseph and others described, but saying that they're in a hat. So clear back in 1829, that's when an antagonistic source describing this is somehow hearing through the grapevine the claims of what's going on, but it's not a rock in a hat. It is the spectacles. Now, what are the spectacles? Again, it's the silver bow, kind of a figure 8 eternity symbol, right? Like glasses, basically, with 2 stones. So we're still talking about stones. That's important for when we get into this a little bit later. Spectacles and a hat is what it says. The following year in the Cincinnati Advertiser, they wrote, quote, "A fellow by the name of Joseph Smith, who resides in the upper part of Susquehanna County, has been, for the last 2 years, we are told, employed in dedicating, as he says, by inspiration, a new Bible. He pretended that he had been entrusted by God with a golden Bible, which had been always hidden from the world. Smith would put his face into a hat in which he had a white stone and pretend to read from it while his coadjutor transcribed." So here it's talking about a stone in a hat, not necessarily spectacles. Now, maybe there's something getting lost in translation, and the claim all along was 2 stones and a silver bow, like spectacles, going in a hat, but then playing the telephone game and whatnot, right? It's getting corrupted, and now it's 1 stone. But that's what it says in 1830. Of course, then in 1834, we get Mormonism Unveiled, which is kind of the first anti-Mormon book that's published, an attempted expose using affidavits and letters and investigative reports to try and like uncover what is this Mormonism stuff and really attack its legitimacy. In particular, targeting Joseph Smith's character and his claim to translate the Book of Mormon. Commenting on Joseph's earlier efforts, that book says, Joseph Jr., in the meantime, had become very expert in the arts of necromancy, juggling, the use of the divining rod, and looking into what they termed a peepstone, by which means he soon collected about him a gang of idle, credulous young men to perform the labor of digging into the hills and mountains and other lonely places in that vicinity in search of gold. His business, they continued, was to point out the locations of the treasures, which he did by looking at a stone placed in a hat. Now, this is tying the use of a stone before the Book of Mormon to treasure digging. Allegations being made that Joseph and his father and others were involved in using these spiritual abilities and a divining rod and a stone to go after treasure. I'm not going to get into that tangent. Maybe that's a topic for another musing. You have the Richard Bushmans and other historians of the world that put a lot of stock into what Joseph's critics are saying about him and claiming that he was involved in all of this treasure digging kind of stuff and using the divine or the opposite, right? Using the almost like satanic spiritual influences to go seek after the world's riches. Then there's plenty of pushback to that. And you get the Hannah Stoddards and others of the world who say, why are we listening to Joseph's critics who are making these claims when, Joseph himself and others around him are denying it? Not going to go into the treasure digging so much, but just another example of a claim being made in 1834 about Joseph using what they term a peepstone. Someone who's quoted in that book, Mormonism Unveiled, among the letters and affidavits that were compiled and put into the book, was Isaac Hale. This is Emma Smith's father, who at the time is not pleased with Emma's choice and Joseph's activities, and so he's hostile. And in the Susquehanna Register in 1834, this is a few months prior to the Mormonism Unveiled book being published, so they grabbed it from the paper and put it in their book later in the year. This was published in that newspaper. Isaac said, quote, "I told Joseph and Emma that I considered the whole of it, the Book of Mormon translation, a delusion, and advised them to abandon it. The manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the Book of Plates were at the same time hid in the woods." So again, a critical claim from someone who's not present while Joseph is translating, but he's hearing it perhaps from Emma, who was helping as a scribe, or from other sources, or he's just inferring or regurgitating what the critics are saying. All the same, this is a contemporary claim that's being made. What does Joseph say, though? So in 1831, Joseph is at a conference in October in Ohio. And Hiram, his brother, requests that Joseph give a firsthand account of how the Book of Mormon came to be. And the prophet said, according to the scribe, so it's not Joseph recording this in his journal, this is someone writing down what he said at the conference, that Joseph said it was not intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Joseph apparently also said that, quote, it was not expedient for him to relate these things. So given an opportunity just a year after the church has been formally organized, Hiram says, hey, let's talk about this and share. Joseph withholds and says, this isn't ready to be published. It's not the right time. It's not expedient. All the particulars aren't intended. So this could be a matter of pearls before swine, right? Trying to keep things sacred. And the fact that this had a seer aspect to it and this very kind of divine angelic thing, right? Could be that Joseph's trying to say, no, I'm not going to talk about that. What he did talk about was 2 years later in 1833 in an open letter to a newspaper editor talking about this precise issue. He did give a few particulars. He said that the Book of Mormon was, quote, found through the ministration of a holy angel and translated into our own language by the gift and power of God. Okay, by the gift and power of God. Now, you may recall that that was what was recorded in the Book of Mormon in Omni, Mosiah the First, when Mormon is writing, and he says that in the days of Mosiah, a large stone was brought to him, and he did interpret the engravings by the gift and power of God. So Joseph is himself adopting that term, saying that he translated the Book of Mormon, quote, by the gift and power of God, utilizing this Book of Mormon language from Mormon. Okay, so there's an example. He's not giving explicit details, but he's just saying this was a gift and power of God. 5 years later, in the Elders Journal, Joseph is doing a bit of Q&A and answering a whole bunch of stuff. One of the questions listed, how and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon? His answer was, Moroni, the person who deposited the plates from whence the Book of Mormon was translated, in a hill in Manchester, Ontario County, New York, being dead and raised again therefrom, appeared unto me and told me where they were and gave me directions how to obtain them. I obtained them, and the Urim and Thummim with them, by the means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. So Joseph is saying, I got the record, I got the Urim and Thummim, and by those means I translated the plates. So you might look at that and say, let's believe Joseph. And all these claims, which we're about to get into, of him using a separate stone, must be wrong. To that I'd say maybe, because Joseph here doesn't say, I didn't use anything else whatsoever. He just says, I used the Urim and Thummim to translate the plates. That's not necessarily exclusive. It doesn't rule out other tools and abilities and gifts and whatever to accomplish the same thing, right? Potentially. In 1830, let's rewind a bit, because that last Joseph quote was 1838. Let's go back to 1830. Here we have Martin Harris, who is a witness, by the way. He's helping with what became the lost 116 pages as a scribe. He's quoted in the newspaper, The New York Telescope, where it says, he proceeded to the spot, Joseph, and found the Bible with a huge pair of spectacles. Of course, this is the quote-unquote gold Bible, the Book of Mormon. With a huge pair of spectacles. He is said to have shown some of these characters to Professor Samuel L. Mitchell of this city, who could not translate them. Martin Harris returned and set Joseph to the business of translating them, who, quote, and now it's quoting from what Martin Harris claimed to this reporter, by placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into them, Joseph Smith said he could interpret these characters. Okay, so that's the little snippet, allegedly, from Martin Harris. We're getting this from some other newspaper that claimed to have this interview from him in 1830, but it's consistent with what he's going to say later. Placing the spectacles in a hat, that, of course, is consistent with the year prior in the New York newspaper, placing spectacles in a hat, right? There are other sources saying that exact thing. A few years later, we don't know exactly when, so this is Joseph Knight Sr., a close friend of Joseph's, who helped him financially and with all kinds of support. And sometime in the mid 1830s through like the mid to late 1840s, Joseph Knight Sr. wrote his own biographical sketch of Joseph Smith. And it's only like 5 or 6 pages or something short. But in there, so this is somewhat contemporary, presumably before Joseph even died, maybe within a year or two following, Joseph Knight Sr. wrote, quote, now, the way he translated was he put the Urim and Thummim into his hat and darkened his eyes. Then he would take a sentence and it would appear in bright Roman letters. And then he would tell the writer and he would write it. Then that would go away. The next sentence would come and so on. But if it was not spelled right, it would not go away till it was right. So we see it was marvelous. Thus was the whole translated. This is in this kind of reminiscence that he writes later. So that's pre-1850, pretty close. Again, saying putting the Urim and Thummim into the hat, or the spectacles. So in sum, the only claims of a peep stone or a single stone are from critics, not witnesses. And, Martin Harris, who was a witness, and Joseph Knight, who was a close friend and around, even though maybe he wasn't a scribe himself, they say that the Urim and Thummim, the spectacles, the two stones, went into a hat. So that's what we get before 1850. Let's go to later claims after 1850. These start to emerge like in the 1870s and the 1880s, so decades later, even half a century later from when the Book of Mormon was translated. Let's start with David Whitmer. This is one of the quotes that the church historians mention. David Whitmer is a possible witness. He wasn't a scribe, but a major portion of the translation of the Book of Mormon took place in his parents' home in Fayette, New York. So he could have had a front row seat to the process, depending on how liberal Joseph was with someone being able to kind of see up to the side what's going on, or walk through a hallway and peek in, or who knows what, right? So he's not a scribe, but he's a possible witness. Later in 1881, he says, quote, "I stated that he used one stone, not two, and called it a seer stone. The interpreters were, as I understood, taken from Smith and were not used by him after losing the first 116 pages as stated. My statement was, and now is, that in translating, he put the stone in his hat, and that this was accomplished by putting his face in his hat so as to exclude the light." Okay, so he claims that the Urim and Thummim, the spectacles, were taken away after he lost the first 116 pages. Now, David Whitmer, later in life, he's left the church, right? And so he's kind of got that angle to some of this. He might be perhaps more critical than he would have been had he said this more contemporarily earlier on. But he's claiming that the spectacles were taken, which leaves this seer stone, which David says is what he put into the hat. Now, just because something was taken away when Joseph temporarily lost the gift does not mean that it wasn't restored later when Joseph was re-given that gift to continue after having to repent and be severely chastised for indulging Martin Harris and his wife. So even if David Whitmer is correct that the spectacles were taken, it doesn't mean that they weren't given back, okay? Okay, let's go back to Martin Harris. We mentioned the 1830 interview in which there was a little snippet shared secondhand about what he allegedly said. He himself is a witness, again, for that earlier portion of the Book of Mormon being translated. In an 1859 interview, so this is nearly 3 decades after that first quote, Martin says, according to the interviewer, "The two stones set in a bow of silver were about 2 inches in diameter, perfectly round and about 5/8 of an inch thick at the center, but not so thick at the edges where they came into the bow. They were joined by a round bar of silver about 3/8 of an inch in diameter and about 4 inches long, which with the two stones would make 8 inches. The stones were white, like polished marble, with a few gray streaks. I never dared to look into them by placing them in the hat, because Moses said that no man could see God and live, and we could see anything we wished by looking into them, and I could not keep the desire to see God out of my mind. And beside, we had a command to let no man look into them except by the command of God, lest he should look aught and perish." Okay, so Harris again, Martin here, he describes placing the Nephite interpreters in the hat rather than, a single chocolate-covered stone. So he's talking about the two stones here, right? This appears to contradict David Whitmer's claim. It also appears to contradict Emma's account, which we'll get into, of Joseph using his own seer stone. The early newspaper accounts, the 1830, right, consistent with what Martin is saying here. But then we get to 1881. So this is now another 2 decades later. This is documented by Edward Stevenson, who is a prominent missionary at the time. He plays a pivotal role in bringing Martin Harris to Utah to be restored to the church. Of course, Martin being one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, this is a big deal. So Stevenson is on a mission and in Ohio, and he documents his interview, his discussion with Martin Harris, and escorts him westward to the Saints. It says, he said that the prophet possessed a seer stone by which he was enabled to translate as well as from the Urim and Thummim, and for convenience, he then used the seer stone. Interestingly, so this potentially conflicts with Martin's earlier testimony in 1830 and in 1859, where he's talking about the two stones. He's talking about the spectacles. But here later in 1881, now he's mentioning this separate stone that he translated with as well as from the Urim and Thummim. And for convenience, perhaps comfort, ease, who knows, he then used the seer stone. So this either conflicts with that earlier testimony, or you could say it expands it, because earlier when he was saying he was using the spectacles, he probably was. And then if indeed he was later using this separate stone for some other convenience, then that could also be true. So that doesn't necessarily need to conflict. Let's go to Emma. Emma herself is a witness. She's an early scribe to the process. In an 1870 letter, she to another woman, she says, "Now the first that my husband translated was translated by use of the Urim and Thummim, and that was the part that Martin Harris lost. After that, he used a small stone, not exactly black, but was rather a dark color." So here's Emma saying, sure, Martin Harris was talking about spectacles because when he was there helping, that's when the Urim and Thummim was being used. But then either because it was taken or because Joseph had a gift with this other stone or whatever, then he started using that for the subsequent parts of the translation. 9 years later, 1879, in an interview with her son Joseph Smith III on her deathbed, she says the following: "In writing for your father, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him. He sitting with his face buried in his hat, with the stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us." This is stone singular, presumably then still this not exactly black but dark colored stone. This quote is used by church historians and others in the church in manuals and so forth, among others with Martin Harris and David Whitmer, to bolster the case that the seer stone was in fact used, which is fine. I just find it a little funny, and I can't help but bring this up again when I see it happening, which is fairly frequently, that you get church historians and leaders who are favorably citing this interview with Joseph Smith III, Emma, much later in life, and she made this claim about the seer stone. Therefore, hey, look, it must be true because Emma Smith said it. And yet in that very same interview with her son, she affirms that Joseph never practiced polygamy, that he wasn't involved, that he fought it throughout his life. And those same church historians and leaders, oh no, Emma's totally wrong. It's a total cherry picking of what Emma's saying. Either she's telling the truth or she's not. I think we have to approach her words with a bit more consistency than many people choose to do. So she could be right, she could be wrong, but we have to, I think, pick one and not cherry pick what we want and then claim that she's lying and misguided and the other stuff. Her brother-in-law, Michael Morse, same year, 1879, he's being quoted secondhand by another person. So this is many steps removed, but it's another quote. Michael Morse allegedly says that when Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, Morse, so this is actually the writer saying this about Michael Morse, had occasion more than once to go into his immediate presence and saw him engaged at his work of translation. The mode of procedure consisted in Joseph's placing the seer stone in the crown of a hat, then putting his face into the hat so as to entirely cover his face, resting his elbows upon his knees, and then dictating word after word, while the scribes, Emma, John Whitner, Oliver Cowdery, or some other, wrote it down. Okay, so that's just another claim. He's saying he had occasion to see this happening and that it was the seer stone. Now, again, the Hannah Stoddard's of the world, or it was that social media post I shared, there could be some merit in that these people didn't understand what they were seeing and that it was, in fact, the seer stones, in other words, in the spectacles, or it could be that there was additionally and separately a separate seer stone that Joseph was using. What about Oliver Cowdery, right? This longtime scribe of Joseph. You would think that he of anyone else, right? Emma was much earlier. Martin Harris was just for a brief period of time. Here's Oliver, right, who's doing the bulk of the work. And you would think that we would have these quotes to rely on from him. We don't. He was present with Joseph for nearly 2 months. He did the bulk of the translation after the lost 116 pages, but he has, that I could find, no direct quotes revealing any insights about Urim and Thummim versus seer stone. Okay, so we have all these quotes and claims and differing opinions about what actually happened. And there's been plenty of pushback over the years too. For example, in the late 1930s, there was a prominent Latter-day Saint educator, studied under James Talmage. He's an author. This guy's name is Francis Kirkham. And in the Church's magazine, The Improvement Era, he wrote, quote, "In the opinion of the writer," in other words, himself, "the prophet used no seer stone in translating the Book of Mormon. Neither did he translate in the manner described by David Whitmer and Martin Harris. The statements of both of these men are to be explained by the eagerness of old age to call upon a fading and uncertain memory." Okay, so the allegation here is that, hey, half a century later, they're not quite remembering exactly how things happen. That position has a lot of merit. I myself, in past musings, have used these late stage recollections so as to kind of undermine their credibility and their accuracy, because they're purporting to remember verbatim something that happened, 50 years earlier. And who can do that? Especially, when there are all kinds of incentives to side with the new narrative and way of doing things. But then, okay, some prominent, random Latter-day Saint educator and author, who cares? Well, here's Joseph Fielding Smith, who, after working for decades as a church historian, he writes The Doctrines of Salvation. And in volume 3, he says, and here he is, president of the church, this church leader writing this stuff, "There is no authentic statement in the history of the church which states that the use of such a stone was made in that translation. The information is all hearsay, and personally, I do not believe that this stone was used for this purpose. It may have been so, but it is so easy for a story of this kind to be circulated due to the fact that the prophet did possess a seer stone, which he may have used for some other purposes." So no one's really disputing, though, even those who are saying he didn't use it for the Book of Mormon, that Joseph, in fact, did have a seer stone, right? Beyond the Urim and Thummim, that this did exist, that there are other reasons, perhaps, that he was using it and ways in which it was utilized, that he was reluctant to share, as he was when Hiram, prompted him to share, that, hey, this isn't expedient and I ought not to do it, that it's this sacred gift and power of God that he doesn't want to too openly discuss. But here's Joseph Fielding Smith sharing his personal opinion that he doesn't think the stone was used for the translation, even though you have the David Whitmers and Martin Harrises of the world later, and Emma Smith later, claiming that the stone was in fact used. All right, let's have some concluding thoughts here to try and make some sense and about all of this kind of stuff. One thought is, why did Joseph Smith say Urim and Thummim only? If in fact he did use a seer stone after the fact, either because the Urim and Thummim was taken or he's advancing and he has this more convenient, tool to use, why did he say Urim and Thummim only? Well, Joseph really only called these interpreters. He used the Book of Mormon label, interpreters or spectacles or gift and power of God. The term Urim and Thummim wasn't, as far as I could learn, connected to this question until 1833, and that's by Oliver Cowdery and W.W. Phelps. Phelps himself, writing in the January 1833 edition of the Evening and Morning Star, he says, "The Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, by an unlearned man, through the aid of a pair of interpreters or spectacles, known perhaps in ancient days as teraphim or Urim and Thummim." So here's Phelps saying gift and power of God, interpreters, spectacles. These are the terms being used for what Joseph utilized. But then he says, known perhaps as the Urim and Thummim. So they're starting to connect this kind of biblical reference, occasional reference to the Urim and Thummim, to what's in the Book of Mormon and what Joseph had. That 1838 Elders Journal, right, where Joseph responds and says it was the Urim and Thummim, you could argue that that was just a brief response in a long list of things, and he's not being super exhaustive. Perhaps if someone asked him a follow-up question like, hey, did you use anything else for the translation? Perhaps he then would have said, well, yeah, then I moved on and I used this seer stone. The Urim and Thummim were both stones. They're not eyeglasses that we know of. The stones were not transparent, apparently. And so, perhaps Joseph asked the Lord if he could use a different tool, right? Or he had this existing seer stone that he occasionally used, and he was trying to commune with the Lord through this other tool in addition to the Urim and Thummim. It's possible that because of the criticisms of the naysayers about all this treasure hunting stuff, it's possible that he wanted to downplay that and felt that the seer stone, the peep stone, would just foment the critics, and therefore maybe he was just kind of reserving that a bit more, but he was more open to kind of saying the Urim and Thummim, perhaps because that had biblical support. Hey, look, this was being used in the Bible. We are the restored church. We have it today, right? And Urim and Thummim and seer stone, can be used interchangeably. After all, the Urim and Thummim is just, they're seer stones. So really we're talking about plural versus singular, but we're still talking about stones that apparently can allow you to communicate or receive information from God. So who cares if it's 2 stones versus 1? Right? Like that's what this whole question boils down to. I mean, certainly there are people who claim that Joseph made it all up, that it's all bogus, blah, blah, blah. But like for the people who say Joseph Smith did translate the Book of Mormon with the gift and power of God, then does it really matter if he used 2 stones versus 1 stone? If he's using stones that are a gift and power of God and a means through which God can communicate with his chosen child, this seer, like who cares if it's 1 stone versus 2? It's entirely reasonable to me that if God can consecrate these 2 stones fastened in a bow and call it the Urim and Thummim and the interpreters, that he can do that with any other stone. He can do it with any other instrument, a divining rod, or nothing. He could just directly, give you knowledge or communicate through an angel. Like, who cares? God can use anything. Why are we so limiting as to say, like Hannah Stoddard did, it is contrary to how revelation happens for Joseph to look in a hat at a stone? Give me a break. Who are you to put rules around how God can communicate with his children? It's like when the brother Jared needed light as they went in the barges across the sea, and God's like, what do you want me to do? And the brother Jared, he melted some rocks. He created some rocks and said, hey, will you touch these and illuminate them? God was like, hey, sure. Right? Like, there's just rocks, but God can use these things as an instrument. He can turn them into tools. So if he can do that with the random 2 rocks inside of the Urim and Thummim, why could he not do that with another stone as well? Either way, the book exists. It was translated. We have its result. The result is the most important thing. Who cares about Edison's failed 1,000+ attempts to create a viable light bulb when you go and turn on the light switch? You don't care about that history and the nuances and the failed attempts and the perspectives and claims and criticism. The light works. Your room is illuminated. Things are great, right? Similarly, I think we have the Book of Mormon. We have the result. And Joseph repeatedly said the book was translated by the gift and power of God. There's record of him studying the characters on the plates. There's record of him using the Urim and Thummim. There's claims about him using a seer stone. There's a record of him moving on and not needing any of these things and just having the ability to directly translate it. How he did it, though, he remained clear. It was by the gift and power of God. That can encompass all of those things. His own studying of the characters, using the spectacles, using a single seer stone, using a hat, right? Or gaining so much insight and knowledge and understanding the language now that he can just directly translate. Like, all of those things can be true of being the gift and power of God. And so it doesn't really matter what criteria, what tools were used, other than the fact that God facilitated it. We have the book, and either the book is true or it is not. It's also funny to me that many people will criticize Joseph Smith for claiming to have these spectacles and this seer stone and all these things. And yet most of these people are Christians who believe such things about the Bible, and, that Moses parted the Red Sea and God flooded the entire earth and only Noah and those with him survived. Like, people believe all these supernatural, miraculous, huge things in the Bible, but for whatever reason, they are unwilling and unable to entertain the idea that such events can happen in our day. How limiting. Again, it's like the Hannah Stoddard saying, God does not reveal things in this way. For these people, these Christians, to say, God does not communicate with people using the Urim and Thummim today unlike he did in the past. They're trying to handcuff God. Another interesting, and we'll wrap up here, another point for me is, why preserve the Urim and Thummim at all? Like, assume that Joseph did use a seer stone, that was a tool that he had and was part of the process. Why bother sealing up with the record these interpreters if God would know that Joseph later would have this seer stone that he could use. I mean, we could say the same thing of the sword of Laban, the Leahona, which were included, with the records. We could say the same thing about the gold plates at all. Keep in mind when Joseph translated, did his inspired translation of the Bible, for example, correcting a bunch of verses or giving us, the book of Moses or even the book of Abraham, when you had this papyrus, he wasn't necessarily directly translating. All these people are like, that's not what the papyrus says. It doesn't matter. That could have just been the prompt that triggered Joseph receiving, all kinds of stuff. Think of section 7 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Here's what the summary at the top says. The revelation given to Joseph Smith, the prophet, and Oliver Cowdery at Harmony, Pennsylvania, April 1829, when they inquired through the Urim and Thummim as to whether John, the beloved disciple, tarried in the flesh or had died. The revelation is a translated version of the record made on parchment by John and hidden up by himself. He didn't have this record. Joseph didn't have access to this parchment, and yet he was given through the Urim and Thummim this revelation that was a translated version of the actual parchment that John wrote and hid. That could have deteriorated for all we know, right? Like it could not exist anymore somewhere in a cave or whatever. Maybe it was on, flimsy parchment or whatever, and it degraded over time. But God is just like, oh, here's what John said, and we got this revelation. So Joseph didn't even need the gold plates, right? Like, yeah, he was studying some of the characters, but so then why bother? Why bother with the Leahona and the sword of Laban and the plates themselves or the interpreters if Joseph had a seer stone? And to that I might say, well, one of the most powerful parts of this whole process was the witnesses, the people who were saying Joseph was doing this, the kind of tangible testimonies that provides, that it's not just Joseph making it up. It's like, no, he had these tools. There were these objects. The plates did exist. They exist in time and space. These are real. They are a record. They are an evidence of a people that once lived and died, rather than the product of Joseph's mind. So I see this as a blessing from God to afford opportunities for the Joseph Knight seniors and the Emma Smiths and others to see what Joseph is doing, to see that he's using these tools and that through these tools he's accomplishing this great work. I think it strengthens the position that Joseph was receiving revelation through these tools rather than like consulting other things or memorizing something in his mind and then dictating it to Oliver Cowdery or whatever. It's like, no, he's using these tools. And so it provides kind of a testimony of it. Okay. For those interested, there's a lot of quotes that I didn't share, a lot of other stuff to analyze here. There's a deep rabbit hole to go down. There's actually a great article on this called The Spectacles, the Stone, the Hat, and the Book. I will link to it in the description of the YouTube video. For those of you interested, this is from The Interpreter, which is an LDS scholarly journal. Has a bunch of great additional insights that you can go explore if you want to study this even more. What do I believe? I mean, number one, I don't care. Like, I focus on the fruit, the result. We have the Book of Mormon, right? Now, you'll get people who say, well, we should care because are we going to listen to Joseph's critics and enemies, or are we going to listen to Joseph himself? And look, I'm on Team Joseph. Like, that's my position when it comes to things like polygamy, right? That I think we're too likely to listen to hostile people and other sources and not listen to, Joseph himself when he's emphatic. But on issues like that, he's very emphatic multiple times. On issues like this, he's kind of silent and cagey, right? He says the gift and power of God. He does one time say the Urim and Thummim, but he doesn't necessarily exclude there being other things. He's allowing other people to observe what he's doing, but he's not talking a lot about it. He's keeping it quiet either because of the sensitivity to the treasure hunting, claims of the past, or the sacred nature of it, or some other reason, right? Or maybe to try our faith. Who knows? All that being said, I do think that Joseph used a seer stone in addition. I do think it doesn't cause me any issues, because if there's two stones, why can't there be one? If there are multiple Urim and Thummim, if Abraham had one and Mosiah had one and the brother of Jared had one and Moses and Aaron had one, like there could be multiple in the past Urim and Thummim. Plural. So why not Joseph's itself being a Urim and Thummim? Section 130 talks about us later, everyone receiving their own Urim and Thummim and a white stone that's basically a personal, revelatory device. It's like your divine chat GPT that you can like consult with and answer anything. Why would we limit God and say that there is only the Urim and Thummim when, for all we know, there are already multiple? Forget Joseph Smith with all the other people in the scriptures. There could be multiple different Urim and Thummim that's going around, and seer stones and so forth, right? So I don't want to put handcuffs on God, and I think it's entirely plausible that Joseph had a Urim and Thummim, that the spectacles existed. Again, that was a physical testimony of these people existing and God preparing these things, but that doesn't necessarily preclude Joseph from having access to additional gifts and powers from God to accomplish his purposes, and gaining so much ability and knowledge in the process that he no longer needs those tools, but is able to directly, as a seer, receive this information and understand what's right, what's true. God doesn't need a rock to communicate with people, right? If you're so in tune with him, like, he can just directly communicate. So Joseph may have got to that point and used these things kind of as crutches or as tools along the way. For me, this doesn't really matter. I don't really have a lot of like strong feelings here. If in fact Joseph never used a seer stone, and those were claims made in later years by, people with false recollections, big whoop. He used 2 stones instead of 1. Like, I'm not going to cry myself to sleep because, oh my gosh, he didn't use a single stone. What matters to me is the end result, the product, the fact that I can turn the light switch on and have illumination. It's the result that matters. We have the Book of Mormon. We have to account for it. The reality is we don't have a ton of strong contemporary explanations, in large part because Joseph is intentionally saying, right, that he wants to withhold these things and not be too open about it. He says it's not intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, that it wasn't expedient for him to relate these things. So there could be divine purposes there, and why the record is a little bit murky, or why we don't know. Perhaps, again, it's the Lord's intent to say, yeah, I'm going to make these tools available, but I don't want everyone to explicitly, I don't want their faith and their knowledge to be in the tools. I want them to have to grapple with the fruit, with the result. And so let's intentionally not share details about this, because people have to not fixate on that. They have to fixate on, is this the result of the gift and power of God? I think it is. As I shared a few months ago in my musing about 8 reasons why the Book of Mormon, that Joseph didn't write it, couldn't have come from him. I think there's strong evidences, rational, logical evidences of the Book of Mormon's veracity. I take Joseph at his word. I think he's telling the truth here. And so, yeah, I think he did use a seer stone. I think he just was a little reluctant to talk about it and share it. But in the end, to me, what matters more is the book. We'll wrap there. Hope you guys have a great Sunday, and I'll see you next week.